The only thing that I do now is focus on my value. Because when you take all those people away, you take all those things away, you take the motivating factors away, what are you left with? You're left with yourself looking in the mirror in the morning, in the evening, and asking yourself, am I worth it? And a driven person says yes, despite all odds.
Excited to have today Yael Simon. Why don't you identify yourself by all the things you do?
Right. So first of all, thank you for having me. And I don't identify myself by the things I do because they are things I do. If you take me out of that thing I do, then I'm still the same person and apply all of my energies and all of my strengths and my creativity to whatever job it is. And I'm very versatile. So the job itself doesn't matter as much. I am by nature, and my drive is very much, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a self-starter, I'm a leader. And, practically and technically, I build teams, I build companies, I build foundations, I build infrastructure and funding for lots and lots of different vehicles, everything from nonprofit to corporates. And I've built my own companies as well.
You are driven. You are driven. So, what is your Marvel Comics origin story? How did the superhero that you are, how did you become this?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the compliment, but I am by no means a superhero. It's a constant balance of survival and thriving. I think that's where I sit at all times. How much am I doing to get through to the next day? And then how much am I doing to kind of really live and leave this world a better place than when I entered it? And what am I doing to contribute to my own life, my children's lives, my grandchildren's lives, and how can I contribute to making the world, like I said, a better place? So that's, I don't see myself as a superhero at all. In fact, I really eschew it because it's just a smokescreen. I promise you. You might say, oh, it's so amazing, but that's what it sounds like. Being me is very tough. It's very hard. And I'm not going to make it sound easy at all. Okay. So my backstory, or I like it the way you said it, Marvel Comics origin story. I'm originally from Chicago. My father was born in Baghdad. And the reason I usually start with that side of the story is because his culture has really shaped a lot of my upbringing and the way I see the world. And that works two ways. It's not consistent like, oh, well, isn't that great or isn't that awful? Because there were traumatic parts of his childhood and my upbringing. And then there were really inspiring parts of my childhood and his upbringing. But in the end, it's really just a narrative. And this is an arc. And as I said earlier, there is his story. And it's how I interpret now, certainly, in kind of as I'm getting older, how I interpret the messages and the things that I heard and I saw, and the maturity, I think, in a person, and certainly in any individual in their personal life, and then certainly in their professional life, is how to interpret what you saw and you heard and you learned in your childhood and how you apply that to real world experience. And like I said, I think that goes for personal and professional aspects of a person's life. So in my case, there were tremendous stories of, overcoming adversity. I mean, his whole life and childhood was overcoming adversity as Jews in Iraq, expelled in 1951, had to walk across the border when he was a child, the middle of 9 children, and then live in a transit camp for 10, 15 years until he kind of broke free of that that structure, came to America, knocked on doors, was the ultimate entrepreneur and self-starter, started, the story is that he was looking for a job and had no skills and no education, no training. And he just knocked on doors with a mezuzah on the door and, the Jewish scroll, and thought, well, I can come and teach your children Hebrew. And that's how he started. And so my childhood was filled with these stories of when he grew up, but was also a very patriarchal setting. And this is where I'm going to get probably a little bit controversial in terms of interpretation of the kinds of skills and signals that he conveyed. The patriarchal side was difficult because the culture is very much yes, sir, whatever you say, and you lose yourself. I can say this now as an adult, and, having thought about it and matured, you kind of lose your sense of identity. And I think somewhere in your assessment, I actually saw that about this concept of like pretzeling yourself into what people want and what people expect of you and how you want them to view you. And there's a positive side of it, but the negative side is also that you end up becoming a people pleaser. And at the end of that process, you're alone. And then you think like, well, who am I if I'm not trying to adapt constantly to other people? All the other.
We talk a lot about identity on this podcast, and it's something that as the agricultural revolution took off and, what the neurotypical brain has is something called the executive function, huge executive function. And it supports the very simple identity of butcher, baker, candlestick maker. And so not having the executive function, that's the old joke is, you want to send a driven into a ring of hell, ask them to figure out who they are. And so that, fluid identity, call it either chameleon or we call it situational identity, where I can fit into any group, and it's hiding this kind of deeper feeling that I'm not part of. And so it's a very interesting combination of, I could have called driven the shame-based personality type or the trauma-based personality type, but we adapt with that. So give us your identity discovery story.
So I think you actually summarized it really well because when I was filling out the assessment and then I saw the results, I have to say out of all the pages, that's the one that resonated with me the most because I'm going through that process as an adult, as a mother, as a grandmother as well. And so, really trying to look back on the years of my life of how I adapted and how that was a benefit to me, certainly in every type of workspace I was in. When I decided to found my own company, what was I doing then? How did I fit in with groups? Like, for instance, if you look at my work history, it's so varied. People often say to me, well, I don't understand. You're so many things. And it's very difficult for people to put their finger on it. So, I've been involved in fintech and then I've been involved in AI and been involved in anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing. And so what is it? So part of that, I think, and finding my own identity is I enjoy being involved in all these things. I like it because, and speaking to another point in the assessment, I'm a lateral thinker. For me to look at a broad spectrum of topics and to say, well, I learned from this and I can apply it to there. And I learned from here and I can apply it to here. And I thrive on that. So, even my professors in universities said, we like that kind of multi-directional thinking, which actually coalesces by being, a lateral plane. And then you can sort of come to a conclusion of different questions you've been asked. And then, you arrive at your own conclusion. So to speak about myself and my own identity discovery, I think that aspect has been very helpful to me. But then the detriment, of course, is at the end of the process, you're like, well, if I'm always just trying to fit in, like you say, or, I think it's a form of NLP, and I think that's a business tool. But if I'm constantly doing that, then what happens when I don't? And who am I when I don't? And so that's the process I'm in right now. And what I've found, and it's a tremendous amount of hard work. This is not something I discovered overnight. This is a process of a lot of mistakes in my life, personal and professional, and a lot of failures. Failures are what built me for sure. Kickbacks, people kicking me down, women especially trying to cut me down. That's been tough, but it's really been a strength as well and a pool of strength. And I remember that. And it's kind of that constant rebuilding of confidence, the meditation every morning of like understanding, I'm worth it. I'm here. I deserve a place. And so a lot of it is self-belief, and it's not fake self-belief, but it is self-belief that has to constantly be generated.
And so you alluded to being a driven woman, and Rachel can attest to it. It's very different than being a driven man. It's okay if I'm an asshole because I'm hard charging. Give us that side of being driven.
I think that's a unique space and deserves its own chapter, really. I'm not a man, so I can't speak to that. What I have found, though, was that in my work career so far, and I was just talking about this yesterday with a colleague, I've only ever worked for men who are exceptionally challenging. I hope they're not listening to this. Exceptionally difficult and challenging. People who have a reputation of, it's usually very like ultra high net worth individuals and very challenging. Like people wouldn't work for them. They would be afraid of being crushed or being hurt or being, but I think part of my fearlessness is that I'm not scared of people and I'm not scared to say what I think. I have enough confidence to say what I think and so on and so forth. So, what would happen, the dynamic would be that there's a driven man who needs a solid advisor or somebody, a project manager, or somebody, like in my case, was always a consultant to build infrastructure, to build, collaborative partnerships to kind of like expand their interests. And so I would be the driven woman. And here's the really interesting part about this dynamic is that everybody was able to be in their own space. And I found it very comforting, meaning that the driven man had his own space. It never affected me. And me being a driven woman was always like an asset because I was self-sufficient and I didn't encroach and I wasn't needy and I didn't like constantly need somebody to tell me, well, you did a great job and like wait around. I'm a self-starter. So I think in those scenarios, and they've happened in the last decade, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times that I've ended up working for people, exceptionally challenging individuals, maybe not good managers, but brilliant, successful, tough, have their own backstory as well. They always have a backstory. And self-made. I think that is the common denominator of all of these driven men. They were all self-made. Yeah. And what happened as a result, and I've dealt mostly in, like I said, in the last decade and a half, with people just like that, whether they were colleagues or partnerships or whatever. And so me being a driven woman in those scenarios was not just acceptable, it was people were grateful that I was self-sustainable, right? That I could self-sustain. Now, if you change that dynamic, there was an episode where I worked for a very driven, globally successful woman. And here's the thing about that. I think it is contextual. It's very difficult for me to answer that for lots of different women. I have worked alongside of very driven women. Sometimes it was tremendously successful. Sometimes it was very competitive and it ended badly. In the most recent episode that I worked, I actually was employed as a consultant to a globally successful woman. I found her to be inspirational. I found her to be one of the most extraordinary women I'd ever met. She's a role model. And I didn't treat her like always, I'm in awe of you all the time, but I did hold it close to my heart. So I was constantly balancing this respect I had for her and admiration for what she'd accomplished and the way she handled things and the way she spoke and the way she led. Her leadership was extraordinary. But at the same time, I wasn't afraid to speak truth to her power. And, if I felt there were, you hired me as an expert and I'm going to tell you what I think. Right? There was never a fear of that. So I was never eclipsed by another woman's power. Does that make sense?
So there's both of these different type of driven women. What do you think is what makes one woman that person that you admire versus the other one that's very competitive and hard to work with? Because what I am seeing from talking to a lot of driven women are very good at working alone. Like, I'm the only woman in the team, bunch of guys, great. And then when it's, a few women in the team, some guys, it starts getting friction. And then if it's only women, it's like, we want to tell the world we're banding together, but we aren't. And I think that that's something that we kind of have to take it out from the dark, moldy place and bring it under the light because, the world is changing. Femininity is becoming more honorable and people are realizing that every human being has some part male, female. Driven women tend to have more masculine energy. And I can see that threatening non-driven women, but then sometimes it also threatens other driven women.
So first of all, I love the way you phrased it. You talked about femininity and kind of like that making a comeback. And I really appreciate that. I've thought about this question because I've been in so many scenarios and, whether they were profit or not-for-profit or volunteer organizations working with women. And again, like I said, The most of them were very successful. Some of them were not, right? Some of them ended badly. And I think about that. I've thought about why. I have thought about this question a lot. And then I've also observed my own behavior when I'm with these two different kinds of women. The women who are confident enough that they're not threatened by me. And then the women who, for whatever reason, I mean, you're asking me a question about their psyche. It's very difficult for me to get into their shoes. I try as much as I can to understand it. But, when you're kind of in situ, it's very difficult to why are women being so, pardon my language, but bitchy? Why are they, why is this happening? Why are they so competitive? I'm not fighting. I promise, I don't want your job. I don't want your position. I'm here to work collaboratively and work together. And so my answer that I found was twofold. It's always two things with me. One is that I found the women who I could work with are always have a sense of, like, a strong sense of self and confidence of what they know how to do and what they don't know how to do. Now, I'm really good at that. I am good at saying, I know that's my strength, is saying, this is what I can do, but there are areas that I cannot touch. We need somebody else to take care of this, Also, I've observed myself. The second thing is I've observed myself in these two groups. And I noticed that when I'm with the women who are self-confident and are not threatened, I'm much more active and I participate much more in the conversation. I feel like an equal, and I'm happy that I'm not in charge, frankly. I'm happy that all of us are taking this on, and that we naturally find the delineation of our strengths and weaknesses. And then we kind of come together and say, great, you're great at finance, and you're great at storytelling, and you're great at strategy. And, I've built a few organizations like that, especially for women, because I helped co-found an entrepreneurial hub for women, females who were founding companies. And so I always ended up being in the space of strategist and advisor. And there was always somebody who was in charge and the main founder, and I would support them. And I was very happy in those roles because everybody knew what they were doing. In the other scenario, where the roles were less clear and it looked like there was everybody kind of needed to do everything, I felt there was more competition. And I noticed my own behavior in those scenes where I get very excited and very involved in the beginning and let's do this and let's do that. And I can see the future and it could be like this. And then, and then there comes an equally strong person on board who might say, right, this is what we're going to do. And as soon as I hear that tone of voice, I have this sixth sense that if I don't back down now and let them be the only voice, that it's not going to end well for me. And so I naturally recoil and sit in the background. And then I just say, right, tell me what you want me to do. I'm happy to do this. And I do it to a very high level. So I noticed that when there are other strong women and the roles are unclear, it's like there's this conditional. The roles are unclear. Women are competitive. Nobody knows who's the head. People's roles are too similar or overlapping. I find that's where there is more competition, and it could lead to unpleasant situations.
The psychobabble around that, and we've talked with my previous podcast co-host, Megan, about owning your power as a woman, owning your value, and not trying to actually grab for more power, because I know my power and I know what I'm good at. How did you learn that? Because that is an expression on your face, because it's a rare quality that women, and I've got books and archetypal stories and all kinds of stuff trying to get women to understand that you own your value. And for a shame-based person, driven, but we are, owning that is really hard to do. How'd you learn it?
Okay, so I think I said earlier, it's a very painful question to answer, but it's important.
You just answered it. As hell, didn't it?
Did I? Okay. It's a painful question to answer, but it's necessary, and we have to address it. And I'm happy to, because I've been through a lot, and I've seen both sides of the river. I really have. I want to reference the book Driven by Daniel Pink, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and it's a great book. I just did a postgraduate master's degree at Oxford, and in organizational leadership. And one of the first modules, we discussed motivation. What motivates a person? And the head of the sort of cohort, the professor, she said, I want you all to read this book. And there were like 3 highlights. I can like summarize, save everybody 2 hours of their life. 3 aspects of being driven. There's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And the whole point of being driven is to understand that being driven is not extrinsic. It's very much intrinsic to understand yourself and what motivates you as a person, as a human. And this does not involve money. This goes beyond, and they explore different scenarios of what it would like to be motivated and how do we examine people's motivation when it doesn't come to circumstantial things, right? And so answering your question, how did I learn it? Partly through failure and thinking, there's this feeling that you can end up spiraling from this need to prove yourself constantly.
Yep.
And that is a black hole. Because at which point are you going to be satisfied that that is it? You are worth it. When is that going to be? When are you going to be satisfied? Yeah. Who's going to be the one to come and tell you? What is going to be that episode in your life that's going to be that moment that it's dawned on you that I deserve to sit at this table. I deserve this, this position. I deserve this amount of money that I'm being paid, whatever it is. I deserve the respect and so on and so forth. Part of that, I think, is very much ego driven, and the need to fit in, the need to identify, the need to prove either to yourself or to other people. And I'll be honest with you, I've been through all of those cycles, and now I'm done with all those cycles. And the only thing that I do now is focus on my value. Because when you take all those people away, you take all those things away, you take the motivating factors away, what are you left with? You're left with yourself looking in the mirror in the morning, in the evening, and asking yourself, am I worth it? And a driven person says, yes, despite all odds, I am still here. I am still worth it, right? And I've always been worth it. And then you are then drawn to areas where you are valued. Do not go to areas where you are not valued. Do not waste your time with people who do not value you. Life is short. Do not spend one more minute with anyone who doesn't value your intrinsic strength and what you bring to the table.
And that is a very painful process. In my book, Driven, it is, I talk about a Japanese koan that when you finally reach the top of the 100-foot pole, what is the next step? And the answer that took me 2 years to get to made me laugh for literally 3 days until I separated my abdominal muscles from my rib cage. I literally laughed at myself so hard because the only correct answer that is suitable for the Zen teacher that I was working with is there truly is no pole. There never was a pole. But it's that realization, it's that moment of what the heck in it, what am I doing? And that, Angela Duckworth grit, which I'm a big fan, is that deeper, I'm grit. That's what I am. And, that I'm resilient. I am these things. And there is no top of the pole. But as Drivens, well, I always joke that if we don't have a pole to climb, and I hope it's greased, knowing that seriously, because it's in that's where we find our true values. We're ridiculously resilient, but that true value of what you're good at, and you said it through failure. Oh. How do you, the expression on your face? But I teach, long range shooting. I do a meditation shoot with guns, and it is I say it 100 times throughout the day. You learn from your misses 1,000 times more than your hits. Give us one of your failures and what did you learn?
If you ask people, oh, do you know Yael Simon? And oh, she's so successful. It's so funny that people see the successes and I see the failures. But that is...
You have success amnesia.
That I like that phrase. I have to think about that. Are you suggesting that other people forget them or I forget them?
You forget them because you're
Oh,
driven.
yeah, I do. I do forget. And, I'm not always, I mean, I'm past the stage now where I'm like, what next? What next? What next? I'm done with that. I am always thinking, what next? I remember when I got my master's in international business law, I'll never forget, my oldest daughter accompanied me with her husband and my brother who came from America. It was very exciting. And as we were walking toward the graduation hall, with these beautiful robes, law, masters in law, it was like a really big deal. I was so excited about the whole thing. And then suddenly I spotted people walking down the street with us and wearing red striped robes. And I'm like, what is that? And so I asked one of them, and they're like, oh, this is a PhD. And I'm like, that's it. I'm doing a PhD. I got to do the PhD. I got to do the PhD. And my daughter says to me, she goes, why? I was like, look at the red robes. And of course, it was never about the robes, but it's like, I didn't even finish this, and I'm already thinking about the next thing. And so part of that I've retained, that excitement of like, this is great. What's now? Not because I'm insatiable, but because I love learning and because I think the process of starting and finishing is so important to a person's approach to problem solving, which is essentially what I do, right? In all the roles I've had, like I forgot to say, I said entrepreneur, leader, and problem solver. And so it's finding strategies about how to solve things. And I think that when you have the failures, you understand critically what the other side of success looks like. And so you kind of try to find somewhere in the middle. But I want to answer your question specifically of like, how did that come or how did I learn that? I think that was your question. It is a painful process, but my discovery of that value, and I don't want to belittle this at all, it's not a meditation process of sitting in the morning and having, very specific and intentional thinking about the day. Yes, you must do that. You must do that. However you do it, whether it's through prayer or meditation or yoga or whatever it is, you must do that, because to set an intention for yourself and how you're going to react, how you're going to behave, how you're going to interact with people, what you want out of the day. And I would highly recommend getting these diaries, the 6-minute diary. It's a very, very specific kind of diary, and it is about being intentional. And a lot of this talks about your value and what I love about this is, and I hope this brings an interesting element to this podcast, is that, and I've talked about this before in my life, I know I have when I've done public speaking, is treating your life as if it was like a bit of a business plan. Now that might sound cold, but it's not. It's actually a really rudimentary way of like a very structured way to think about, what am I up against? What's the market cap of people like me? Where do I fit? What's the competition? What am I looking to do? What do I want to achieve? How long is it going to be? What's the timeline? What problem am I trying to solve in the world? What's my solution? It's a pitch deck right there, right? So like, if my life were a 12-slide pitch deck, what would that look like? So I think about that a lot. And then I also, learning my value didn't come from other people saying, you're good at this. It came from my mentors saying, snap out of this, focus. This is what you are here for. This is what your purpose is. And going back to this other book called Driven, it focuses very much on that. Why are you here? What is your mission? What is your purpose? You are your own startup. You are your own foundation. You are your own company. Why are you here in this world? And thinking about that, and then I'm a very big fan of mentors. I've had them for 25 years already. I go to them for all kinds of discussions when I'm in crisis, when I'm breaking down, when I've had failures. And when I tell you about the failures, and you ask me what's an example of a failure, there were pockets of being unemployed and either not having clients as a consultant or a consultancy which ended early and before I felt it could come to fruition. And not because anybody did anything wrong, just because the client decided, that's where they wanted to finish. And so like I wasn't able to achieve what I wanted to achieve. That's one side of like what I would call, failure. Why? Because my success rate was to be X with this amount of time and to achieve this. And if I didn't do that and I fell short, maybe by no purpose, no fault of my own, I felt like, well, I failed the client or I failed myself or I let myself down or like whatever. That's one aspect. Another aspect of failure is I once put on a very, very big event, a global event for businesswomen with another very strong, powerful, successful woman, which I've kind of referenced. And I found that process to be, I mean, so difficult and so painful and so threatening that I started questioning my own value. That's how I know how bad it was. Is that I found myself, when I was asked to speak publicly and welcome the audience to this global event we'd put together, I found myself saying, I can't, I'm not worth it. Who am I? I'm nobody. I just want to be somebody quiet in the background. And here's what happened as a result of me saying that. And I think it's important to understand the follow-up. As a result of me losing confidence in myself and not standing up for my value, not saying, yes, of course I'll do this. This is a call. I have to answer the call. And this is what I'm meant to do. And I know when somebody says to me, Yael, you should speak. You speak so brilliantly. You're so inspiring. And when I'm faced with that call and then I turn it down, and I know that it's my fault that I turned it down, it's nobody else's fault that I turned it down, then the result of that particular episode was that I got cut out of everything. You know, the other founder just erased me from the program, the press, the thanks, the everything, you know, cut me off completely, didn't speak to me. In fact, the company that she worked for, when I tried to restart some activities afterwards as a follow-up to this event, you know, I got hit with a cease and desist. It's like, I mean, and on one hand, you could say that was a failure, but I know the only failure there was that I let myself down. It was about me.
So that the only problem I have in this world is myself.
Yeah.
And that is the shift of value. That is the shift of, because you're owning your life. I mean, that moment of ownership of really, and it's not that other people need to fight for me, but I need to fight for me too. And
so I want to say something about that. I'm sorry to jump in there, but I don't want to let you go anywhere without me saying about that sentence. Here is what has anchored me. No one is coming to get me. No one's coming to save me. No one's coming to support me. That's it. It's me and me and me alone. I will work with a lot of people. I will meet a lot of people. I'll be friends with a lot of people. I'll have relationships with a lot of people. But at the end of the day, I am all I have. So if I get in my way, I only have myself to blame. So I've done a lot of beating myself up. It's necessary. You need to get to that point. And then it's the process of building yourself back up again. And that is long and it's arduous and it takes time and a lot of forgiveness of yourself and a lot of understanding and being kind to yourself. And then you come to a point, and I'm not exactly there yet, but I would say I'm mostly there, of I am worth it.
Yeah. And it's for me, it's been finding people, mentors that are truly honest with me. And I know they're being honest. And I feel their view of me, and I can internalize, they see something in me that I can't see. And it's in that maybe they're right. And then I test it and think, maybe they are right. Holy but it is a process of actually tearing yourself down first. And that's why, addiction and everything else is such a blessing when you get on the other side.
You spoke about being gentle with yourself. One of the conversations we've had in the past was about empathy and how much more you accomplish with that in leadership with yourself. And I think women between women, I think that's where talking about the solution for women being so competitive, I think it comes from, yes, you spoke so much about identity, and a lot of what Dr. Doug talks about is understanding that there's that observer that you have in your head, and everything is a narrative, and it's just a narrative, and it doesn't matter. Like talking about your parents' narrative. We don't absorb it in our DNA. It's not you, it's the narrative. And so we know our value, we have that identity. And then when we treat each other with just empathy of like, I see you, you know?
I really identify with that very much because again, empathy is something you have to learn. It is a skill, it's a muscle, but it has to be practiced again and again and again and again. And you can't stop, because the minute you stop is the minute you start not seeing other people, right? So, I'm sure you know that very famous story about the man who, was very selfish and egotistical, very wealthy man. It's like a folk tale. And his elder came to him and said, "Why don't you scratch the mirror?" And he scratched the mirror, the silver side of the lining of the mirror, and it became a looking glass. And then he was able to see other people and their suffering and everything else. And so it's a great metaphor, but it is very true. There is a balance of me, thinking about myself, and I'm out for myself and I'm the only one, and so on and so forth. But then built into that, and I think they have to coexist. And that's also a skill, is learning how to coexist, because a lot of people are just very black and white. It's very kind of like, either or. It's either me or them. And that's where this competition, unhealthy competition, I think, comes in as well. But to understand where the gray lives, and that you can take care of yourself, self-care, and be empathetic toward other people, I think they go hand in hand. And so it is seeing people where they are, not where they should be necessarily, but feeling them right there and then, understanding that things don't just happen. When you meet people, when you see where they, the situation that they're in, everything is context. Whatever you're seeing of a person is only a very, very small percentage of their life. So, and they are showing you what they want you to see. Again, part of your assessment was like, do you have a sense, an intuition about people? I do. I don't think I'm always right. I think that there are times where I've gotten it completely wrong, especially with family members. I tend to get it wrong a lot. Maybe things are too close. But, I do have a sense when I meet people, what are they searching for? I mentor a lot of women, right? I also have my own mentors, and it is definitely a structure that's a go-to for me. It is a system of checks and balances for me. And for other people, I think, Rachel, sometimes people are just waiting for people like you and me and Doug to come along and say, you can do this. Do you realize the skill that you have? Do you know how good of a listener you are, or whatever it is? Especially women who are coming, let's say, from homemaking and then want to go back into the workforce. I've given a lot of talks to groups like that. And that is the number one question. It's kind of like, wait a minute, stop comparing yourself to what's there in the market. Start thinking about the transition from, having served all these other people around you for so long, and start thinking about how you can serve yourself and what you would like to do. And, kind of start asking those questions. And then usually what happens is the women are like, I don't know what I want to do, and I don't know what I'm good at. And you'd be shocked at how many transferable skills there are from, let's say, homemaking and child rearing into real world experience. Yeah. And some would argue that mothering and housekeeping is a real world experience. And I would agree with that. It's validated. It's a valid job. So I think there's a transition to be made. And I think there's also a fundamental fabric that's woven between, either or. It can coexist. You can coexist. You can take care of yourself, feel confident, have that healthy sense of ego, and also be empathetic, sit in other people's, walk in other people's shoes, understand where they are, give them the validation they're looking for, give them the inspiration they're looking for, genuinely mean it, because you dug deep in yourself to find that. And so that process you can share with somebody else.
Beautifully stated.
I think, Doug talks about the narcissistic fantasy of driven entrepreneurs. And what that does is we get hyper-focused on a goal. So we lose our empathy for everybody and anything else, because we look at anything else as an obstacle. And if I would have to guess, and if I would give the Gallup assessment to, 2,000 entrepreneurs, I think they would come out very low on empathy. And I know I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs Gallup assessments, and they were super low on empathy, but you can manufacture empathy. You can work on it. I've seen it myself in the last few months, like with my kids and people around me, and being able to come off that scale of that narcissistic fantasy, saying, yes, it's me, my goal, and everybody else, and how is this person going to add to that and that person, and, becoming a leader of the pack rather than going at it alone.
So every time you speak, I find like interesting things about what you've said. So I just want to pick up on two things there. One is I have like a visceral reaction to the word narcissist because I've been called a narcissist, by family members and, and the colleagues, not so much. I think it is very much and I'm not belittling it all. I'm just saying my opinion in the beginning was very much like, oh, it's a pop psychology word that's being used like on the internet. And but it's become like an excuse for things. And that's the problem I have with it. It's not actually dealing with the real issues and qualities of the person. And I think the two of you have addressed this in this whole sort of driven culture, this concept of being driven. I think your assessment also speaks to it. It's like, well, if we broke down a narcissist, what does that look like? And then I live very much in the world of like, well, what would it look like if we didn't even have that word, right? So that's just me, again, pushing boundaries, being a lateral thinker, thinking outside the box, thinking about a future where we don't even have that word anymore. So then what takes the place of that? Is it just convenient to use that word and we're not working hard enough to break down the elements of that? That's one thing. And the second thing, that you talked about, you referenced just now is, how do we move from ego and healthy self to, to sort of reaching out and being a leader. And so that's in itself a whole discussion of how do you define being a leader? I spent the whole past year talking about how do we define a leader. And to save you a lot of time with all of my research, I would say to me that leadership is very much about identifying more leaders, right? The whole purpose of leadership. What is the whole purpose of leadership? In my opinion, which I feel is now a bit qualified, it is about identifying other leaders and having a sense of ownership. And within that ownership of understanding a process or a culture or a community or a company or whatever it is, you share this mission, you share values, you share an understanding of responsibility of being a leader. You share the elements of being empathetic and having empathy as a leader. And then what do you get at the end of that process? You are training other people to lead. Because if we break that down, what is that? And there is a bit of an ego in leadership. You cannot be purely a tiny, humble leader. They do exist. They exist on a level that might, suit people. Is everybody a leader? No, I don't think so. I think everybody has aspects of leadership, much like the masculine, feminine, side of it. I think I did a TED Talk on this about the dynamics of giving, that at some point in your life, everybody's a giver and everybody's a taker. And you can't have givers without takers. You can't have takers without givers. And so, yes, you're a leader and you're a follower. And what does that look like? And my answer, and to summarize that, is it's a fluid process. It has to be. The world is changing so fast. We are learning more about ourselves now than we ever did in the last 100 years. Doug, you referenced this earlier when we talked about our parents and the trauma they experienced in their lives and how they dealt with it and how we now are, full of examination of every aspect of how we're feeling and how we're thinking. And, certainly with children now and, Jonathan Haidt's book about the anxious generation, about, examining every element of why we are anxious and why our children are so anxious and like, what are the triggers here? And so we're so hyper aware of all of these things that we have to incorporate that as part of what it means to be a resilient leader.
Yeah, there you go.
And I'll summarize that by just saying that in my book, resilience is not about bouncing back. That is not what resilience is. I was in on a Zoom call with a trauma expert for families of Army of soldiers. And the trauma expert was talking about how the fact that, our children who are in different armies around the world are involved in doing things that we can't even imagine. We can't understand the things that they've seen and that they've done and experienced. There's nothing, unless you are an Army veteran yourself, there's nothing in our lives that we can identify with them on this. And therefore, resilience is not about bouncing back to where you were, because their lives will never be the same. It will never go back to the way it was. Instead, resilience is understanding that things have changed and moving forward.
Beautiful. And that as a trauma expert, it is one of the few disorders, and I air quote the crap out of that, but it is that you come out when you're healed better than if you never had the trauma in the first place. And so it is a incorporation of wisdom into your new way of being in the world. And so it is and what you said on leadership, I couldn't agree more. Brilliant. How do we find you? How do we support you?
How do you find me? I'm on LinkedIn. That's the professional way to find me. I'm right now also in a process of refining and honing the things that I do as a result of who I am. And a lot of this is the exploration of leadership now as well in challenging circumstances. Some of it is technical, AI and philanthropic leadership. That was my recent paper. And I've got a website as well. I'm on Instagram, but my Instagram is really just casual and it's just a good laugh. And you can contact me through my website, I'm pretty sure, and certainly through LinkedIn. That's probably the most secure way to find me. And I always respond.
I'll be careful to not launch any very difficult founders your way, because I think you've had enough of that. But
no. I welcome it. I welcome. Bring it on. Bring it
love
on.
it too. And it is, because what's difficult for most is much more natural for us.
One of my mentors told me we only grow through pain. And at first I was like, that doesn't sound very good. But pain can be interpreted in different ways. I think the better word for that, in my opinion, is discomfort.
Yeah. And takes it to actually become what we are, and really owning your value through pain. And, it's really a falling away of what you're not. It's a process. Well, thank you for your time.